Good evening, everyone. I'm Ruth Murgatroyd, and I volunteer for the York-Sunbury Historical Society in a couple of capacities, and I must say this is one of my favorites. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual presentation in the York-Sunbury Historical Society Speaker Series with John Lutz. I have been looking forward to this presentation called Manny McIntyre, Elite Athlete and Sports Pioneer, since I was sent the speakers list a few months ago. Let's begin the program by having our guest Ralph Thomas make introductions. Ralph, I'm handing it over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I have a gentleman that I'd like to introduce, and I want to give you a quick idea of how I got involved, or give you a sense of how I got involved with this man. And he called me up one time about, I think it's 12 years ago now. He called me up and said, I want you to do a dinner for a dear friend of ours and a very important person connected to the province. And I said, okay. Who is that? And he mentioned, and I said, well, that gentleman's from Fredericton. Why should we get involved with doing this in St. John? And he said, well, I think you would be the person to do it. But, you know, John, we all know how John can convince us to do things. And it took a while. I mean, it took like 2 years before we finally put that dinner together. And I didn't realize, I knew who the sports hero was, but I didn't have very much information on him, and I heard about him, but yeah, so what? But then when John I think it was 2 years later, he kept asking, and 2 years later he came right to St. John and said, listen, we've got to talk. And that's what we did. We talked, and he explained to me who this gentleman was. And John, I was really surprised, but you know, I said, okay, let's make it happen. And you know, I've known John for some time now, but let's face it, I found that he's a very brilliant man. He has so much inspiration that when he passes it on or comes to town, everybody gets fired up. He does have the perseverance it takes to get something done. He has that dignity, and he has the tenacity to never let go. So please welcome John Lutz.
Thank you, Ralph, for those kind words of introduction. And I thank the organizers for this opportunity to make a presentation about Manny McIntyre. Now, I'm going to focus on Manny's background, his sports career, family, the recognition he's received, and of course, I'll have some concluding remarks. Now, by way of introduction, Manny was an elite athlete, a Canadian sports icon in both baseball and hockey. He's been inducted in several sports halls of fame, and he's a role model, both as an athlete and as a person. Then, of course, I'll have concluding remarks. My personal connection to Manny goes way back. I was born with my hearing loss, felt different, was different, and sought difference. And when I went to a hockey game, the MONCTON Hawks, the year Manny played there. And when I saw this big, strong, highly skilled man playing hockey, and he was black, he became a hero to me. And it maintained that throughout my lifetime. A hero just as important to me as Babe Ruth and Willie Mays, Andy Bathgate, Terry Sawchuk, and so on. Now, contact with Manny, I started with at the New Brunswick Multicultural Association. My wife was the executive director there, Cynthia, and the newly elected president was Skip Talbot, who was black. So we started talking about black people that we knew in common, and Manny's name came up. Skip knows the family. So contact was made with Manny's sister in Montreal. Next time we went to Montreal to visit Cynthia's mother, I called her. She gave me Manny's phone number. I called him, and he welcomed me to come visit. So I left the house at 6:30, planning to be back around 9. I didn't get back there till 11:30. I spent the first hour being 11 years old. Imagine being in the presence of your childhood hero. It was quite an experience. We spent 4.5 hours talking, Manny doing most of the talking, and about sports, principally hockey. So over time, we became close friends. Visits, letters, cards, phone calls. And one Easter, there was a family gathering, and Cynthia and I were in Montreal visiting her mother. And so we were invited over. And during the course of the visit, Manny offered me his hockey stick. It was the only piece of hockey equipment he had left. And I declined unless all of the family members were in agreement. Well, he quickly worked the room and said, "It's done." So he gave it to me, and I asked him if he would sign it. And it has been since, it's now in the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame, where it really belongs. Some years later, well, I had a lot of visits with Manny, as I mentioned, and he, as the years went by, he was really not well. My last visit, it was kind of sad. I later received a phone call from Manny Jr. saying that his father had died. And so we talked, and it was agreed that I would come up, I would drive up to Montreal and deliver the eulogy, which I did. And I can tell you that that was one of the great honors of my life. I'm going to shift gears here, shift focus, and talk about family background. It's African, with Loyalists, descendants of Loyalists, and those perhaps refugees from the War of 1812. Now, I want you to note that both the paternal and maternal ancestry is white. Now, Manny's parents, Edward Martin McIntyre from Elm Hill, Mabel Ethel, and she was also a McIntyre. She was from Cumberland Bay. And the father, he was a laborer, and mother a homemaker. You can see his father there. Now, his grandparents were working class folks. They were laborers, farmers, homemakers, housekeepers, midwives. Now, eventually, the family, the McIntyres, settled in a community called Otnobog. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It was an early settlement in the province, one of the earliest, and it was renamed Elm Hill when it incorporated in 1806. Now, it's located inland in Queens County, near the St. John River. It was, in the early times, a prosperous farming community up until the 1960s. And then there was a decline as population moved away. Nonetheless, there was an annual picnic organized and held for years. And I went to one 5 or 6 summers ago and had the opportunity to make a presentation about Manny. Now, the family moved from the Gagetown, Elm Hill area to Devon when Manny was about 6 years old. So basically, that's where he grew up. He was one of 6 children, and the homestead is located at 152 Hughes Street. Now, Manny attended elementary school and Fredericton High School, and of course, the family attended the local Baptist church. Now, I want to talk about, I'll just wait until the next slide is over. That's the homestead. It looks much differently there than it was when Manny and his family lived there. Now, I want to talk about his hockey career. Mike Wyman and Bill Young, both from Montreal, sports historians, both had the opportunity independently to interview Manny. So we have some rich information of his background, his hockey career, his baseball career. And so I've drawn from that their research several times. Now, Manny played hockey on the St. John River. That's where he learned to skate. It's where he learned to play hockey. And that's where he developed his strong skating. He was known for his long stride. And that developed because he was often the youngest. When the puck missed the net, he had to be the one to skate down the river and retrieve the puck. Now, he played schoolboy right up until semi-pro. This is in hockey, of course, in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, Northern Ontario, Quebec, and it may surprise you, Paris, France. Now, he's on a number of championship teams, and the next photo will show the Devon's Superior School. He didn't play on it, he was the coach. And think about that, a young black man being a coach back in the late 30s. So many other championship teams that he played on, actually, from Devon and Fredericton, Marysville. He was on the Fredericton High School team when they won the New Brunswick Championship, and they were Maritime finalists. Now, the next photograph shows the Fredericton Merchants. They were the commercial league champions in the Fredericton area in 1937 and 38. Manny played in Timmins, Ontario, for the South Porcupine Porkies. In the Northern Ontario Hockey League, they were Allen Cup semifinals. The Allen Cup was the cup for winning the senior championship in Canada. He also played for the Truro Bearcats. They were Maritime champions, and that team too, went to the Allen Cup Eastern playoffs. And the last team that he played for, a championship team, were the Sherbrooke Saints in Quebec, in the Quebec Senior League. Now, Manny had, all these years in hockey, only 3 black teammates. John Eatman, who you see in the photograph, at the commercial level, and the Carnegie brothers, Herb and Ozzie. Now, Manny heard about the Carnegies. He called the manager in Timmins, where they were living and playing, working the mines. He was sent a return ticket. He tried out for the team, and the line was immediately formed. Manny played together with the Carnegies for 5 years in Timmins, Shawinigan Falls, and Sherbrooke. Now, the next photo shows the famous colored line. From left to right was Ozzie, Herb, and Manny. There's another photo of the colored line, and you may be able to see it, but there's a quotation on the bottom, and it was certainly attributed to Manny. If you can't go first class, don't go at all. And you can see that reflected in the way that they're dressed and the way they stand. Now, the colored line split at the end of the 1948-49 season. It was an excellent line. The line dominated wherever they played, and they filled rinks again wherever they played. The line was highly respected, but they received some interesting racial epithets. For example, brown bombers, dark destroyers, black aces, among others. Now, on a more positive note, Willie O'Ree, whom all of you would know from Fredericton, first black to play in the NHL, he paid tribute to the line in his book, Willie, saying, as a team, I looked up to Herbie and Ozzie and Manny. They paved the way for me. They just never got the chance I did. Now, note, in Timmins, the players worked in the mines, played nights and weekends. Manny had an accident working in the mines. He got his left hand caught in a machine, and he lost the knuckle and his middle finger and the tip of his other finger. It was treated by the doctors, and so eventually he continued to play. And the next photo shows him in the Army. He enlisted in 1942 when he was at perhaps the peak of his career. He left and joined the Army. He played hockey and baseball, of course. The following spring, he had medical issues. The doctors noticed his left hand, that it wasn't, they missed that in the initial medical. So he was honorably discharged, and he resumed his sports career. The next photo is the Racing Club de Paris, 1947-48. Manny and Ozzie and Mush Morehouse, who's from Fredericton, the 3 of them played on the Racing Club de Paris, owned by Charles Ritz of the Ritz hotel chain. Canadians were recruited. The team played 64 games in major centers throughout Europe. They won 60, tied 2, and they lost 2. Manny and Ozzie were offered contracts but they declined. Now, the next photo was the Fredericton Capitals. They were New Brunswick champions. And there were three, Millie McIntyre, Mush Morehouse, and Manny are all in the photograph. On the front row, from left to right, second over, right next to the goalie, that's Billy, and then Mush Morehouse, and in the back, it's easy to tell where Manny is. Following photograph is Manny when the year he played for the MONCTON Hawks. That was his best season. His role was that of a playmaker and not one of protecting his line mates. That season, he played 59 games, 71 points. He had 36 goals and 35 assists. His career totals in hockey: 187 goals, 278 assists. His total was 465 points in 468 games. In other words, a point a game. The stats from Paris are not included. Now, I want to change the focus. Manny's grandson, Michael, was playing for a major junior team in Quebec, and they had a game against the MONCTON Wildcats. So his father, Manny Jr., drove he and Manny to MONCTON to see the game. So I was waiting for them in the lobby of the Coliseum, near the front door, and Leopold Belleville walked in. He's the former mayor of MONCTON. So I knew him, so we chatted for a bit, and he asked me what I was doing, who I was waiting for, and I mentioned Manny. He said, Manny McIntyre. I remember the night he came out of the hospital after he had his appendix surgery, and he scored the winning goal, and the crowd just went wild. That's just one of the little stories about Manny. So Manny and Manny Jr., they ended up seating in the upper section of the Coliseum, and I had previously arranged for Manny to be acknowledged. So during the first and the second period, the announcer suddenly comes on, and ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to the famous Manny McIntyre. And then he pointed out where he was seated and talked about him. And he got a standing ovation from quite a few of the people there, a lot of clapping. Manny stood up and he bowed and he bowed and he bowed. And Manny Jr. started tugging on his jacket. Dad, sit down. This was one of the very first times that he was publicly acknowledged since his retirement. And it was a great moment. Now, the next season, Manny moved to St. John, played with the St. John Beavers. He had been traded from MONCTON, and then to northwestern Quebec with the Port Albert Élèves. That was it's a French-speaking community, French-speaking players. Manny's an Anglophone, doesn't speak French. Yet, and you can, in the next photograph, there you can see the C on his sweater. He was selected captain of the team. What a tribute. It speaks volumes to Manny's reputation, his abilities, his leadership, and his characters. Now, the next two photographs show old arenas in the Maritimes. The first one, that's in Middleton, Nova Scotia, 1940. And the next one was in Shawinigan Falls, 1944-45. They're quite unlike the modern arenas. And that's where senior hockey was played back then. Now I'm going to shift to baseball. The beginnings for Manny were in the fields and the Devon school grounds. His career spanned 15 years, from 1937 to 1952. He was basically mainly a shortstop, but played first base and second base, and sometimes he was even a pitcher. Now, he played in several locations: New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, excuse me, Quebec, Ontario, and the United States. Championship teams in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Ontario. Now, the next photo shows the Devon Tigers. 1940, they were the New Brunswick champions and Maritime finalists. Okay, he played with the Truro Bearcats, and that's the photograph in his baseball uniform. Now, 1943 and 44, he played in the Halifax Senior Baseball League with the Halifax Shipyards. It was clearly his best 2 seasons. His batting average one season was .385, and in the playoffs that same year, .488. That means almost every second time he went to bat, he got a hit in the playoffs. He was a first-team All-Star. He was voted most valuable player. And listen to this one. He was voted the most popular player. And you can see here where he's being presented, probably a watch by the league president. That's quite amazing. I have a black man playing in Halifax, chosen through newspaper polls. So it was the general public plus newspaper journalists choosing him. Quite a tribute. Sadly, Manny was not drafted after his best 2 years, and his opportunity to make it to the majors was now gone. And the next photo shows him in Middleton, Nova Scotia in 1946. And he shifted around that season. Not long after he began playing in Middleton, he was recruited by the Sherbrooke Canadians in the Class C Border League. And the photograph shows Manny signing. He was the first Black Canadian to sign a professional baseball contract in the modern era of baseball. And by that, I mean the modern era began in 1902. There were 2 other Black players that had signed professional contracts, but that was previous to 1900. Manny broke the color barrier in professional baseball in Canada, May the 30th, when he signed, and June the 1st, when he took the field. This was clearly an historic moment in Canadian sports history. The next photo shows Manny in his Sherbrooke uniform. There you go. However, he played only 30 games. His batting average was .310, but he had 30 errors due to an injury to his throwing arm from the previous hockey season. Now, he resigned after only 30 games for a number of reasons. Heavy travel by bus, racism in the United States, because some of the games were played there, discrimination from his white teammates, almost all of whom were Americans, isolations after the game. He had separate accommodations. And perhaps the most important one, the desire to return to Canada and be respected as a player and a man. And something else interesting, in 1946, that same year, the New York Cubans of the Negro Baseball League were touring. And Manny had an opportunity to, which was in the community where they were playing. He umpired a game and they had heard about him, so they invited him to go to New York. He played 2 games in Yankee Stadium with the team, and he declined an offer to join the team and return to Canada. Now, something really important to note. Manny was the only Black player in 2 leagues. There were 2 exceptions from his whole career. One, Fred Thomas in Farnham, 1948 in Quebec, and Charlie Pyle, who played with Manny in Fredericton in 1949. They were the only 2 other Black players. All those years. Now, in 1949, he was on the team, and you can see two players over. That's Charlie Pyle. They were the 2 Black players on that team. They was Fredericton Capitals, and they were New Brunswick champions. Now, I want to note that Manny was a fan favorite wherever he played. He was a great player, and he had an engaging personality. Experts and journalists say he was good enough to play in the NHL and Major League Baseball. Many have said over the years, if only he were white. He grew up in a society that did not provide, including athletes, the same rights and opportunities as others. Racism and discrimination were all too common. Now, there are many examples in Manny's career, and I'll just share one of them. When the year he played in St. John with the Beavers, after a hockey game, they went to a well-known restaurant in downtown Fredericton, and some of the players were a bit early, so they went in and they were already seated and having made their orders. Manny came in with the rest of the players. The waitress stopped them and said, "You can't come in here." And she was challenged and she absolutely refused, of course, because he was Black. The players that were seated stood up and they all walked out. And of course, there are other examples. Now, I want to read some significant quotes to you. Dr. Colin Howell, he's a Nova Scotia sports historian, in his book, Northern Sandlots, wrote, "Of all the players in the Maritimes during the 1930s, none was any better than Vincent Manny McIntyre. He was clearly one of Canada's greatest athletes, and not just in his era." Now, SKIT FERGUSON, he and Manny played together in Drummondville in 1947. You see them there. SKIT's a maritime baseball legend. He and Manny played that one season. And he's of the opinion that, quote, "Manny had the skills to play in the major leagues." A baseball scout in the mid-1940s said, "A surefire to make the majors." Now, everyone watching and listening will certainly remember Red Story, the colorful NHL referee. He saw the colored line play when he was refereeing in the Quebec Senior League. The colored line could have played on any team, anytime, anywhere. Well, all of you know the name Jean Chrétien. When he was 14, his older brother was the team doctor of the team in Shawinigan. And so he sat beside the bench. And several times during the course of the game, the Black players would be sitting at that end of the bench, waiting their turn to go on and play. And he was just mesmerized with him. And he said to me, the line was very good. They were very good players. Someone else that you know by name certainly is Jean Beliveau. In conversation with John Paris Jr., a major junior player in Quebec and an international league coach, Mr. Beliveau said, "I believe that the whole line could have played and should have played in the NHL." I'm sure you know the name Scotty Bone, very well-known, famous, and successful NHL coach. He saw Manny play when he was 20 and said, "A great man who should have played in the NHL." Finally, a personal quote from Manny himself. He said to me, "John, I'm not bitter about not making the NHL. I know I was good enough, and that is good enough for me." If you want to see character, you just heard it. Talk a bit about his family. In 1955, there you see them. Rita Vigneault from Montreal. She and Manny had been dating, and they eloped. They were married in Fredericton, Brunswick. He was 36 and she was 18. They had 3 children, Marlene, Manny Jr., and Robert, and of course, several grandchildren. And you can see in the next photograph, Manny with his 3 grandsons. They were all hockey players. Now, some comments about Manny's family. Hard worker, took care of his family, went above and beyond. Kind and extremely generous. Always available to his family. Took care of his mother, sending money during his sports career. Volunteered in the community, coach and mentor to young people. Now, after Manny retired, he had a number of jobs. First, he was a CNR reporter from Montreal to Vancouver. Then he was at Dorval Airport as a baggage handler. And he was a parking lot attendant at McGill University. However, when he retired, he was the manager of the parking lots. And the photograph should come up now. There he is, sitting in his office. Manny also was involved in building maintenance in the community where he lived, Candiac. He's been inducted into several sports halls of fame in New Brunswick. The Black Ice Society, the Timmins Heritage Sports Hall, Canadian Baseball and Sports Halls of Fame. He's been approved for the Multi-Ethnic Sports Hall and the Maritime Sports Hall. The induction's been delayed, of course, because of COVID. Manny has also been nominated to the Order of New Brunswick. Now, the next photo is the cover of a program of a banquet honoring Manny. He was honored posthumously. It was a banquet attended by 250 people in St. John, October 2013. It was attended by the Lieutenant Governor, dignitaries, politicians, union representatives, friends, relatives, some of whom came up from the States. And of course, Manny and Herb's adult children came from Montreal and Toronto. Now, concluding remarks. He was a remarkable, accomplished athlete, highly respected pioneer, promoter, negotiator before the days of player agents. He was a role model for younger players. He was proud of his roots, proud of his family, and he respected his elders. He treated others fairly, generously, and with respect. He was friendly, had an outgoing personality, and self-confidence. In short, he was a great man. Before concluding, I want to acknowledge 6 people for their support and helpful suggestions to me. Skip Talbot and Ralph Thomas from the New Brunswick Black Historical Society, baseball historians Colin Howell and Bill Humber, Charles Ferris, who's their committee chairperson, Melinda Jarrett, of course, from the Fredericton Region Museum, and Stephen Thomas for the technical support. I'm going to conclude with a Japanese haiku poem. It has a simple structure, 1 stanza or many, each with 3 lines, 5, 7, 5 syllables. Haikus attempt to capture the essence of the subject. It's a tribute to Manny and is bilingual, respecting his wife, Rita Vigneault. Manny, honorable soul, l'athlète d'excellence suprême, man of character. I'm going to repeat it. Manny, honorable soul, l'athlète d'excellence suprême, man of character. Thank you.
John asks, did he ever consider returning to live in his native New Brunswick rather than in Candiac, which is near Kanawaki Mohawk First Nations?
Yes, that's true. No, he was settled. Remember that his wife was a francophone from Montreal, and they were really settled there, and his kids grew up there too. So Candiac became home for him.
Teresa asked, did he know /inspire/meet Willie O'Ree?
I believe they would have met, but I don't recall. My conversations with him were a long time ago, and the focus really was Manny, although Willie was mentioned, but I don't recall him saying that they really had met. But chances are they did, because Manny did go back to New Brunswick from time to time. But of course, you have to remember, Willie went out west. He tried out baseball in the States and left because of the racism, and made his career in hockey. And eventually, he played most of his hockey in Western US. And so there were very few opportunities, if any, for them to meet.
David asked, has the city of Fredericton ever been asked to name a playing field or arena after Manny?
The answer is no, but hopefully there is, we think there's something in the works.
Evelyn asked, is the homestead still standing? I think when the picture of the house in Devon came up.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to know if that was still there.
It's still there.
Evelyn also asked, was he drafted to the teams in Ontario and Truro? Did he move there to work and played on the side? So was he drafted or
No, at that time in senior hockey, players were not drafted. They were recruited, sought after, or the players themselves showed up at training camps to try to make the teams. But no, he wasn't drafted.
Did he move there for work and played on the side?
No, he moved there to play. That was his work.
Okay.
You see, he played hockey in the winter and baseball in the summer. There was a time when he went up to Timmins, he did work in the mines. That was a condition of playing on the team. It was a mining company team. But by and large, he didn't work in the summers. I mean, he didn't work outside of playing sports.
John, you said that he didn't speak about racism, but isn't it most certainly the fact that racism prevented him from getting to the NHL or MLB?
With respect to the NHL, no, because senior hockey players were black players were not admitted into the NHL. And it wasn't until Willie O'Ree was admitted, I believe it was 1958, and Manny was long finished. Well, he finished his hockey career in 1955. And towards the end of his career, of course, you wouldn't be drafting a player at the end of his career.
This is from P. Lutz. Do you have some comment about the current situation regarding race in hockey? And what do you think that there has been progress made? Grant Furr comes to mind, as well as that, there are about 6 NHL players that identify as Black.
Well, there have been very few NHL players who are Black who've made it to that level. It has nothing to do with whether Black players can play hockey. Given the same opportunities as the white majority players, there would be more of them in the NHL. There may be something to, in the way of socioeconomic status. I'm not sure about that. But in order to go through the junior, the minor hockey league and the junior system, the family needs to have some financial resources. So that may be a factor. I'm not sure.
Wasn't their experience in France liberating? I recall reading that they were treated like heroes wherever they went. How did he feel about the difference in treatment in his own homeland?
Manny had a remarkable positive attitude. You saw that in the photograph of him sitting in his parking lot manager's uniform. He was truly positive, and not only that, he had a deep sense of himself, and so he didn't have to fit in. He didn't have to meet other people's expectations. He was truly comfortable in his own skin.
We have one from Evelyn. I asked earlier if Manny always played forward. I think Manny would have been an awesome subject for a book. So did he always play forward?
When he played with the Carnegies, he played left wing. And then when he shifted over to the Moncton Hawks, and thereafter, he was a center. He was always a forward. Although, I'm sorry, he played defense one season in St. John.
From Elizabeth Mankey, she asked, was there any difference in racism in baseball and hockey? Which sport did Manny prefer? John?
Oh, he preferred the sport of the season. Yeah, he loved them both, and he excelled in both. It makes a difference when you're really good at something, and he was good at both. So that's part of the answer. Repeat the first part of the question.
Was there any difference in the racism in baseball and hockey?
I think it would have to do with the location as opposed to the sport. It may well be more examples. There would have been probably more examples, or at least noted examples, in the hockey rinks, because the fans are much closer to the action than fans in a baseball field, and when the colored line was playing, they were taunted, called many names and others which I didn't mention. And so I think more so in hockey.
There is a question from P. Lutz. Okay, how about the abuse from other players? For example, baseball, beanballs, and spiking versus in hockey, spring cross-checking, etc.
Sure. Actually, let me just ask that if that's okay. In hockey, for example, in baseball, the typical things that other players might do would be, a pitcher drilling the batter in the head with a ball, and then their own pitcher not protecting them by hitting the next batter and spiking. But in ice hockey, you've got a lot of more opportunity, cross-checking, spearing, slashing, as well as, literally fighting it more directly in that era. Which do you think had more physical abuse from other teams and less support from teammates? Do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, a lot of the abuse was verbal. In fact, I would say most of it was verbal. And the reason I say that is Manny was a big man. He was 6'1" and 195 pounds, solid muscle, and very few challenged him. And that was particularly so in hockey. He did get into fights from time to time, but he could certainly handle himself. There would have been more so in hockey. The team benches at that time were side by side, and the players were close to each other when they were not on the ice. And not only that, the ice surface is a confined surface, confined area, as opposed to a baseball field. And so more of it, Peter, would have taken place in hockey.
So, John, we ask these questions about Manny's experiences of racism, but you don't actually mention very many. And it really makes me wonder how much those of us who are white are appalled by the racism, but whether or not Manny, from what you say, he chose to emphasize what he did well and the people he got along with rather than what was not right. Because I think there's a really interesting story here about the dignity of people like Manny and how they managed to maintain that dignity so that because you present him as a man who was not angry. And so I would kind of like you to reflect just a little bit on that, because the ability of people to put aside the nasty things that are done to them is really a tribute to their own sense of dignity. And that's one of the things you emphasized about Manny.
You're absolutely right. He was involved in quite a number of fights. When he was called the N-word, Rastas and others, and he was, not just by not so often by players, but certainly by fans. And I'll give you one example in Hamilton, when he was playing for the team in Timmins in the Allen Cup playoffs. There was a fan who was sitting close to the boards, kept calling him the N-word. And Manny, skating by, told him to stop it more than once, and he didn't. So Manny clipped him with a stick, and the crowd around were cheering. Of course, Manny was in court the next morning, charged and fined $5 or $10. It was dealt with quickly, maybe because he was a hockey player that it happened that way. But when I was I lived in St. John when I was in grade 7, and I saw him play for the St. John Beavers. And he got in a fight with someone, And when they were going into the, and I was sitting near the, even though it was hard of hearing, I heard what said to him. They were going into the penalty box after their fight, and the penalty box, they were side by side. And when they were standing, they could easily hit each other. And the other player, St. John player, called him a black bastard on the way in. Well, sir, Manny hopped over and he beat the living, you know what, out of him. And so there were examples. In Herb Carnegie's book, A Fly in a Pail of Milk, and he wrote about Manny, about the colored line. And his comments about Manny is that he was quick to fight. He was quick to react. So he just, if you messed with him, then you paid a price. Now he was not a player that sought to fight, but he did react to Race's comments that were directed to him. So I hope I've answered your question.
No, thank you very much.
I have one from Manny. On behalf of our family, we thank everyone who has contributed to this presentation this evening. We are honored, and our special thanks goes to John for his thorough presentation that depicted the great man that my pops was. Thank you again, and love you, John, for everything you have done and still doing for people to know who my father was.
May I have a last word?
Yes, absolutely.
When my introduction, I mentioned that he was a hero to me when I was a kid. And after we met, we really became good friends. We exchanged letters, phone calls, and so on. And there were some visits. And I'm not sure others can understand the extent to which that relationship meant to me. Then and it continues now. And as a consequence, over time, I've become friends with Manny's 3 adult children. And that too is a wonderful, wonderful pleasure, honor. Thank you.
So thank you to everyone for coming tonight. We appreciate it. And I'd like to thank John again for his presentation, but as well Ralph for his wonderful introduction, and everybody for their excellent questions this evening. It's never a disappointment. I find every month we do these, people have excellent questions. So thank you so much for coming. I want to remind everyone that March 17th at 7 p.m., Gary Campbell will be speaking live via Zoom on Rebels on the River, the American Revolution and New Brunswick. So that is our program for next month. Hope to see you again. If you have any questions that we didn't get to tonight or you come up with later, that there is a way of dealing with that. You can contact the Fredericton Region Museum by email at frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com or by telephone 506-455-6041. That information is also on their website in case you didn't catch it. But if you have questions, send them to Melinda at the museum and she'll forward them to John and they will be answered. You can check the museum's website in the Facebook page for up-to-date information on upcoming programs and to find out what else is going on. So I guess this is it. See you next month, I hope. Bye-bye, everyone.